I feel very honoured to be asked to speak for you three, Wendy. When I named this talk, I called it the Return of the Middle Kingdom, with apologies to the Jedi, because I wanted you to think from the beginning a different world, a different universe. There are basic assumptions that belong to Chinese culture and which are really rather alien to us. I'm looking at trying to show you the world that your grandchildren are in. If I finish up telling you a whole lot of stuff you already know, then I apologise in advance, but I don't know where you are at with Chinese history. So today we're going to take a mighty gallop through the revolution, and hopefully we will have some things to think about. I'll switch to Zoom, hopefully. Oh, no, I won't.
Are you trying to share screen, are you?
Yes, well, I'm going to share screen in a moment.
Okay, so
I need to get rid of that first. Right.
Okay, so what's your problem, Wendy? What are you trying to do?
I'm just trying to get up PowerPoint.
Okay, but did you press share screen?
I haven't yet.
Well, yeah, okay. Oh, right, so you're working on your own computer?
Yes.
Okay, and now you need to press the blue share screen as well. Yeah, beautiful.
Right. Am I right or not?
Well, what we've got is exactly what you can see is what we can see. So we've got right. Your half your screen is the PowerPoint, and the other half is that's better.
Right. Am I back to back to where I need to be now? Let's go.
Go back to your beginning.
There's an easier way to do this, but right. So let's start with the bleeding obvious. A comparison between us and China. Australia is almost the same size as China, except that, we have a population of 25 million people. China has around about 1.5 billion, which is a fairly staggering figure. We have a long and glorious history of racism, as I'm sure most of you know. This is one of the pictures that we used to be presented with way back at the turn of the 20th century. This is the way we were seeing China. I've never quite worked out whether we think they're going to come down just by the sheer force of gravity or whether there's going to be some intention involved in this. But you will notice that we have associated the Chinese with immorality and bribery and with opium, which, as you will realise, is fairly ironic. So this has been our picture of China. I want to show you something now that's a little less familiar, and this involves changing my screen. So I will just go back to stopping share for a moment, if I can manage that.
Top of your screen it will be in a red.
There we go, right.
Beautiful.
Now, I need to go to Safari. This is something with which you won't be so familiar.
Don't forget to share screen again, Wendy.
These are deaths in World War.
6. Unauthorized video on other platforms. Metapole Studios. Direct. Metapole Studios MBS created by Alvaro Paz and reserved that must be people program.
Wendy, you've stopped sharing.
Right. So we're sharing again. Those figures are the figures for World War II. I don't know how many of you are...
The average lifespan of an American is 80 years. And an 80-year-old today was 10 when World War II ended. 4 when it began.
Well done.
Now, those are the figures on deaths in World War II. Now, they are problematic in all sorts of ways, and I fully realise that. Nevertheless, that is the real shape of World War II, and it's one that many Australians are unaware of. Most of us now are fully aware that Russia lost most people. Many Australians are unaware that China was, well, frankly, even involved in World War II. So we are actually looking at a level of ignorance that is really quite astonishing. And unless we realise these things, we really don't understand at all where China is coming from. And this morning, I'm hoping to show you something of where China is coming from. So we will go back to PowerPoint, where I think we might be, again, somewhat. Oh, come on.
Share screen on your green button first.
Yes, I'm just trying to get out of this.
Shouldn't need to get out of anything. You should be able to just go over the top.
There we are. Now we're back and I can... Right, so we're ready to share screen again. Right. This is the name of China in Chinese characters. This says Zhongguo, and it means the Middle Kingdom. You can see very easily which character represents middle or central. And the second is kingdom. It roughly represents the court with someone in there at the centre. The Chinese really meant it. When they talked about the Middle Kingdom, they were talking essentially about all that mattered. It was the heart of the world. The only way you could have a relationship with China was as a tributary. China has never been, in its history, it has very rarely gone out to conquer anybody simply because it didn't need to. Its power and its status in the region was such that everybody else simply accepted. that China was the hegemon. And people took their tributes to Beijing in order to be able to trade. Now, there were times when that hegemony was very real. There were times when it was largely a fiction. But it suited everybody to accept that situation since prosperity depended on it. That is not an unfamiliar picture to us even now, that China is simply accepted. China has traditionally worked on soft power rather than military conquest. The Chinese saw the Westerners as very aggressive. China has a saying, you don't turn good iron into horseshoes and you don't turn good men into soldiers. Soldiers have traditionally not been a highly esteemed part of Chinese society. China has a very long Confucian heritage. I don't know how familiar you are with the Confucian tradition, and we all went through the Confucius say jokes. But China's leaders have still been raised in that tradition. Confucianism goes back to around about the 6th century BC. It's interesting that it features at about the same time as other cultures. Buddha lived around about the same time. We're talking about Socrates in Greece. For some reason, whether it's in the stars or the climate at the time, this seems to have been one of the great creative periods in world philosophy. Confucius himself emphasised a right way. And if you saw, I don't know how many of you had time to take a look at Mitch Anderson's documentary, but in there, I think it's Richard Baum who points out that there are two Confucianisms. Confucianism itself is a personal philosophy where a man pursues righteousness, and the way to righteousness is via relationships. They're always conceived as hierarchical, so that at the very top you have the emperor, you have we'll go on to those. Individualism has no part in this. And this is one of the differences I think you have to bear in mind. If you're told in our society, you go along to the kindergarten and your kindergarten teacher says to you of your grandson or granddaughter, oh, he's a real little individual. Are you disturbed by that at all? Does that bother you?
No, of course not.
We're quite proud of that. That cannot be said in Chinese without implying that this child is in some way antisocial and selfish. So individualism is not seen as a great virtue in China. Every school in this country pretty much will tell you that it is there to develop the individual's capabilities. This is not a part of the Chinese scene. The Chinese Communist Party will list among the evils which must be fought human rights. I do not know of a Western leader, not even Donald Trump, I think, would tell us that human rights is a bad thing. The essential goal of this pursuit of relationships is to achieve harmony. And as a political philosophy, this was the emphasis in Confucian philosophy, that we wish to achieve harmony and disharmony is to be avoided at all costs. Harmony comes when we recognise our obligation within our relationships when we fail to carry that through, then there will be disharmony. And that becomes intimately connected with the whole idea of achieving a righteous society. Now, again, like our own tradition, Chinese tradition is rich in philosophies. This is not the only philosophy on which China ran. We have our wonderful ideals. We talk about Plato's guardians and things like that. So we have alternatives. And in the background lurks ideas like Machiavelli's realpolitik. And China too has a tradition of realpolitik, but we don't present this as our real face, as we don't in the West. We don't present Machiavelli as the real face of Western ideals. We choose to present it as democracy and the rights of the individual. Our society is absolutely founded on individualism, and we live with this comfortable association idea that the individual is what matters. Here are the 5 relationships: father to child, ruler to subject, husband to wife, elder brother to younger brother, friend to friend. And each of those is defined very much in terms of obligations. If a Chinese school is defining its role, it will be talking about making good citizens. This is why you educate children, so that they can be good citizens. A country will be well governed when all the parties perform their parts in the relationships. We can see, the Chinese talk about Uncle Dan, Uncle Xi. For us to talk about Uncle ScoMo or Uncle Morrison or Uncle Scott seems faintly absurd. We do not think in those terms. But in China, the whole idea of the nation state is intimately connected with family, recognitions of obligations, and the prime obligation, the ultimate obligation, is your obligation to the ruler, to the state. Chinese history is measured differently from ours. It's traditionally marked out in dynasties, and the dynasty is legitimised by the mandate of heaven. Are you all familiar with this idea, the idea of the mandate of heaven? Am I talking to people who know what I'm talking about here?
I'd assume a lack of knowledge rather than knowledge, Wendy. So explain things you think we need to know.
The mandate of heaven, you basically, it recognised success. If you manage to conquer China, you clearly have the mandate of heaven. Most dynasties were put in place by someone with enormous energy as a conqueror. The Chinese also had a saying about, you can conquer the emperor, you can conquer an empire on horseback, but you can't govern it on horseback. And then what usually happened, the first ruler and the second ruler were usually very competent. By the time you were getting down to the 7th or 8th ruler, you had people who were living in a palace, who had been raised with 1 million servants around. They were probably no longer very good at actually hands-on government. And that meant that you were beginning to be less effective. China was ruled by a bureaucracy, a very large bureaucracy, but nevertheless a bureaucracy that was very thinly spread over China. The loss of the favour of heaven was very clear. It would happen with natural disasters. So if there were mighty famines, the chances were that the ruler was seen as losing the mandate of heaven. Now, there was some logic in that, in the sense that China depended on great public works and the bureaucracy having some efficiency in being able to prepare granaries, to provide against famine, and maintaining large irrigation works. So there was some sense in linking natural disasters and their impact with the efficiency of the bureaucracy. As the rulers became less effective, the dynasty tended to lose control. Like most Asian societies, China has had and has still an enormous problem with corruption. Since the state did not pay its civil servants very well, and it was assumed that part of your salary was going to be the gifts that people gave you. Now, I think we can all see very clearly that those gifts can very easily get out of hand. There's a wide recognition that the gift has to be so big, and as the bureaucracy ran out of control, those gifts became larger and larger. The irrigation works were very often neglected. The granaries were neglected. So China's capacity to deal with disaster in the latter days of the dynasty was very much less than it had been in the early days of the energetic ruler. So we move on to the Qing dynasty. Again, if you have no background in Chinese history, China can actually trace its written history back 3,500 years. It records, some of that is pretty mythical. So when we get back to the very earliest dynasty, it is called the Shah dynasty. Nobody really knew for a long time if it existed, but it is now thought that China's written history does in fact reflect a real dynasty, which may well have begun the earliest irrigation works. If we go back to the Shang dynasty, we're looking at around about 3,000 years ago, when China is producing some stunning bronzes, and Chinese writing actually goes back. The very first bits of Chinese writing can be found on pieces of bone that the Shang used for divining the future. And the earliest Chinese writing is recognizable on those bones. So we have a very long written history. When China's calendars, China's educated people measured their history in dynasties. There is plenty on YouTube that will help you if you want to look them up. There are a million 9-minute clips that will show you the dynasties in their rapid succession. We're not looking, some of you may have been to China. I don't know how many of you have been to China. You will, if you've been, you will probably have seen the tomb of the first emperor. He was ruling around about 220 BC in a very brief dynasty. And his tomb, one of the reasons I'm very sorry that I can't live for a whole lot longer than I can is because I will never see the opening of the rest of the first emperor's tomb. The warriors are only a very small part of it. So, and much of it will never be excavated simply because there is so much on top. At the time that we are beginning to look at Chinese history, we are looking at China as it's ruled by the Qing dynasty. Hu in the current Chinese romanization. Q is pronounced Chu. And the minute you hear somebody talking about the Qing dynasty, move on to another documentary, because if that person hasn't got beyond referring to the Qing dynasty, the chances of them having any good, reliable knowledge are probably fairly remote. The Qing were a foreign dynasty. They came originally from Manchuria, and they were still very powerful as China really began to meet the West. There is a modern map of China's provinces, but it really doesn't matter. When you look at these provinces, you are looking at enormous populations. An ordinary Chinese province is somewhere around 20 million people. So the middle provinces are around about the same size as China, and I think the largest of them is 60 million people. So China always has a tendency to fall apart. As a dynasty weakens, then China begins to fragment. And this fear of fragmentation and disintegration is a constant theme in Chinese history because it has happened so many times. It is always a tension holding those provinces together. And the tendency is for independence to build up in these provinces. You will recognise up in the top corner Xinjiang, which is the area of the Uyghurs and that current problem. Are you with me so far? Is everybody not?
Well, everybody's muted, so they cannot answer you.
Right.
The people that want to, I'll interrupt Wendy. If you do want to show her on the bottom of your screen is a little thing called reactions, and you can give her a thumbs up if you wish. See, can you see how I've put that thumbs up on my phone, Wendy?
Right.
You can do that if people want to. Or just interrupt and make a comment. There's no problem with that. It's just that too much noise if we're all talking.
Right, right. This is the Emperor Kangxi. He was the fourth emperor of the Qing dynasty, a little before the time we are looking at, though China was already in touch with the West. They met the West largely through the efforts of Christian missionaries. And Western traders were nibbling around the borders of China. Kangxi had an interest in Christianity for a time and then abandoned it and decided that it was a fairly undermining philosophy. He was one of China's greatest emperors. This one is the emperor that we will be beginning with. This is the Qianlong Emperor. And it is the Qianlong Emperor who faces direct confrontation with the West. This lady is the one who rules over most of the early period that we're going to be discussing now. The Western powers had come, first of all, as people like the Portuguese poking around places like Macau, trading on the edges, not terribly happy about the conditions under which they traded. And by the 18th century, we'd settled into a tightly controlled system. China permitted Westerners to trade according to ancient custom, and they traded from the sea out of the city of Canton. It was called the Canton system. The merchants were basically locked up in Canton, They were not allowed to learn Chinese. Some of them certainly did, but technically they should not have been learning Chinese. They were confined, they had a curfew, and their trade was fairly strictly controlled. That trade was a bit of a worry to Europe. Those of you who are into antiques and who will know that Europe was fascinated at this time by what we call chinoiserie, Chinese-inspired furniture, Chinese-inspired porcelain. And the trade was very much in China's favour. The West was pouring out vast quantities of silver to trade with China. Silks had been a problem for Western trade since the Chinese emperor, since the Roman Empire, where the Romans had been concerned about the amount of silver that was going out to China for silk, and so Chinese silks were still coming into Europe in the 18th century. Tea had become a whole new proposition. Tea had become it was on its way to becoming basic drink, and the trade in tea was enormous. The first of the great Western international companies, I suppose, was the East India Company, the British East India Company. And the British East India Company becomes, I suppose, a bit like one of the first multinationals. William Dalrymple last year released a book called The Anarchy about the rise of the British East India Company and its power in the city of London and in the English court was enormous. The British were very, very unhappy about the limitations on their trade and deeply unhappy in the age of mercantilism that their silver was flowing into China at an enormous rate. A little bit along the lines of Donald Trump, that the imbalance was huge. So in 1793, under the pressure from the British East India Company, Lord Macartney was sent to China to negotiate new terms with the Chinese government to have the China trade opened. The Macartney embassy raised a whole lot of problems, and I guess it's symbolised by the whole issue of the kowtow. When you approached a Chinese emperor, assuming you were lucky enough to get there, you were required to prostrate yourself in front of him. And that meant your hands out in front of you, and it meant your head to the ground. So you knelt, put your hands out in front of you, your head on the ground to show your deference to the emperor. You can see from the picture, which is clearly a European picture because you will see that the emperor looks rather ridiculous, which he almost certainly didn't. Macartney was not prepared to kowtow to the emperor. That simply could not be done. And so he refused. And from what I have read, it so happened that the Qianlong emperor was in a good mood. And because he was in a good mood, Macartney was permitted to go down on his knee as he would have before his own king. The embassy brought a lot of presents with it, which was the way that people approached the tribute system. And they received the following reply. I will read this to you because it's been said of this document that you don't begin to understand Chinese history unless you understand this document. This is the Emperor's response to George III's letter, suggesting that they would like to have an embassy in Beijing and that trade should be opened. Qianlong replies, swaying the wide world, I have but one aim in view, namely to maintain a perfect governance and to fulfill the duties of the state. Strange and costly objects do not interest me. If I have commanded that the tribute offering sent by you, O King, are to be accepted, this was solely in consideration for the spirit which prompted you to dispatch them from afar. Our dynasty's majestic virtue has penetrated unto every country under heaven, and the kings of all nations have offered their costly tribute by land and sea. As your ambassador can see for himself, we possess all things. I set no value on objects strange or ingenious and have no use for your country's manufactures. This, then, is my answer to your request to appoint a representative at my court, a request contrary to our dynastic usage, which would only result in inconvenience to yourself. I have expounded my wishes in detail and have commanded your tribute envoys to leave in peace on their homeward journey. It behoves you, O King, to respect my sentiments and to display even greater devotion and loyalty in future, so that by perpetual submission to our throne, you may secure peace and prosperity for your country hereafter. He goes on to say, and this is, I haven't put this up on the screen, if after the receipt of this explicit decree, you lightly give ear to the representations of your subordinates and allow your barbarian merchants to proceed to Zhejiang and Tianjin with the object of landing and trading there, the ordinances of my celestial empire are strict in the extreme, and the local officials, both civil and military, are bound reverently to obey the law of the land. Should your vessels touch the shore, your merchants will assuredly never be permitted to land or to reside there, but will be subject to instant expulsion. In the event your barbarian merchants will have had a long journey for nothing, do not say that you were not warned in time, tremblingly obey and show no negligence. This is George III's England being told this. Clearly, this was never going to be a satisfactory arrangement to the Europeans. The Chinese educate all their children to know about the century of shame and humiliation. We should be making sure that every public servant who has anything to do with China is well aware of this, because this is a deep scarring on the Chinese psyche. We've already spoken briefly of the outflow of silver into China. If you watched the Mitch Anderson documentary, you're well aware that the British East India Company had come up with a solution to this. The solution was opium. They could grow it in British India. The Chinese, it was very much in demand in China. The trade was not normally conducted in an official sense. It was not quite admitted to. The opium was carried by privateers into China, but British merchants in Canton had a very fine stock of opium. perhaps we might stop screen sharing for a moment and just see if anybody has any comment they'd like to make before we move on. Would that be a good idea, do you think, Grace?
I reckon, yep.
Right, so
Everybody unmute yourselves. You are already unmuted, Edna.
yes, let's see if I can get rid of this, which is always been a problem.
Top button, a red one saying stop sharing.
Right.
Beautiful.
Right. Have you any comments or questions so far? Are things coming through fairly clearly?
That's good.
Yep.
Right. So we'll just keep straight on and go back to sharing screen.
Unless anybody's got a question or anything that they want to ask? No, looks like you're going fine, Wendy.
Right. So let's go back to screen sharing.
You should be able to click on.
I've got stop share. What happens if I click on the green bar? Ah, yes, that's it. Right.
You need to click on your slideshow button, I think. Yep.
Right. Right.
Beautiful.
And I've gone forward a few. The first Opium War in 1839, and this is the beginning of what the Chinese call this century of shame and humiliation. A very capable Chinese official was sent to Canton, and his specific mission was to curb the opium trade.
Wow.
Lin wrote, his name was Lin Sishu, and he wrote to Queen Victoria via the Times, writing her a letter that is, I rather wish I had copied that letter off for you, because the letter is couched in very Confucian terms. It assumes that Queen Victoria is looking for righteousness, that she will wish to be righteous. It makes the point that she cannot really know about what is happening in China as a consequence of the vast quantities of opium coming in, and that he's sure that she would do something about it if she knew about this. He proceeded to take possession of very large quantities of opium in Canton, and he had that opium destroyed. Much of it was tipped into the sea, some of it was burnt. It took days to do that. The quantity was enormous. And the British were very indignant. They launched a punitive expedition because British private property had been destroyed. When I was a student first studying this, there was a raging argument that said, well, the war wasn't really about opium. It was really about two cultures. It was really a cultural conflict. That is rubbish. It was a war absolutely about opium and about the British right to trade opium into China as they pleased. It was creating all the usual problems we associate with the drug trade, and it was a serious worry to China. The Chinese were in no way equipped to fight that war. They did have their defences, but those defences were simply blown apart. And it brought about the first of the unequal treaties, the Treaty of Nanjing. That included, by the way, Hong Kong. This is where the British acquired Hong Kong, which in what later turned out to be a 99-year lease. But there were 5 other treaty ports that were opened to the foreigners. The Chinese were saddled with an enormous debt to pay for causing that war. So they faced this debt, they faced the British right then to trade freely. But once they had made that trade, other European powers stepped in and demanded trade on the same terms. The Chinese decided that the best way to deal with these aggressive foreigners was to make treaties with all of them. And America included in its treaty a clause called the Most Favoured Nation Clause, which said that anybody, any benefit that anybody else gained in China, they would gain too. And of course, once the Americans had a Most Favoured Nation Clause, everybody else wanted a Most Favoured Nation Clause too. So we all had Most Favoured Nation Clauses, and everything China granted to one power went pretty much automatically to all of them. So from 1842, China was forced to open to the Westerners. In the treaty ports, foreign law operated. Chinese law was pretty brutal. If you have a career in history, you never cease to wonder at the ingenious ways human beings invent of punishing each other and tormenting each other and killing each other in ways, in refined ways that absolutely take the breath away. So Chinese law wasn't going to operate in the treaty ports. So in places like Shanghai, Westerners operated under their own laws. So if you were in the French part of Shanghai, you operated under French law. If you were in the British part, you operated under British law, and so on. The imperial powers claimed large slabs of China as their spheres of influence. The Americans were the first to demand that missionaries have entry to China, and there are a whole series of these treaties that really reduced China to virtually non-existence in Chinese affairs. There are a number of, there's a second Opium War later on. We have other conflicts being fought. You will be familiar, I don't know if any of you remember, what was it called? Was it 100 Days in Peking? The movie about the Boxer Rebellion. And again, enormous indemnities were imposed on China. By 1894-5, Japan had entered onto this scene. Japan had been opened up forcibly by the West, I think in 1856, if I remember correctly. And Japan had done a most extraordinary job of modernising. Japan had a long tradition of learning how to operate from other cultures and had moved very quickly in an extraordinary turnabout. So by 1894, we have the Japanese making claims in northern China, and they fought the Chinese. And so Japan entered the colonial race. In 1904, we have Japan and Russia fighting over Chinese territory, pretty much without reference to China. And to the shock of the European world, Japan defeated Russia and annexed Korea in 1910. I'm not going, I remember as a student being required to learn the terms of all these treaties. I don't think you need to know the terms of those treaties. I don't think the details are particularly important, and they're certainly easy to find. There are pages of them if you wish to look up individual treaties and how it was going. But what it amounted to was that by the end of the 19th century, China counted for nothing. I'm mentioning the Second Opium War because after the first, the British did not deem it necessary to make specific provisions. I think they felt it might be vaguely shameful to make treaty provision about the right to trade opium. So that situation wasn't clarified until the period of the Second Opium War. And the reason I'm giving you these pictures is because if you go to China or have been to China, you may well have seen the ruins of this place, the ruins of Summer Palace. When the Second Opium War was fought in these years, the punishment for the Chinese, and they were certainly not innocent in this, there had been 30 Europeans captured in a first phase of the Opium War, and those Europeans had been tortured and executed in very unpleasant ways. The Europeans, as punishment, destroyed the summer palace of the imperial family. Those ruins are now in a park which visitors are sometimes taken to and which is visited extensively by Chinese and sometimes by Westerners. But this is Chinese school children are taken here to help hammer home the lessons of this century of shame and humiliation. Here is a French cartoon of 1895 which demonstrates the position. You can see there Queen Victoria and the Kaiser and the Tsar, and you can see the French lady Marianne, who commonly stands as John Bull stands for England, Marianne stands for France, and you can see a Japanese samurai there dividing up the Chinese pie while China looks on helplessly and fairly panic-stricken in the background. And here is China's situation in 1900 as the West divided China between them. Korea had become Japanese, by the way, was on the way to becoming Japanese. Manchuria was very much influenced by Japan. It was Manchuria that China and Japan were fighting over. So this territory, where there's territory in red at the top, was basically Russian controlled. The British had said, we will have the Yangtze Valley, and they had South China, the area around Canton. The French had laid claim to the southern region because it was close to the areas they controlled in Indochina. Up to the north up here, the Germans had stepped in. You might remember Germany was a latecomer to the imperial race. So Germany had the area around Shandong, the Shandong Peninsula, they had pretty much declared to be their territory. So we have the nation, the Middle Kingdom, reduced to pretty much naught. In the 20th century, we begin with the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, with the Japanese annexation of Korea. And we will be coming back to this. I'm sorry that I'm going to have to keep crossing periods a little bit. But in 1912, the dynasty finally collapsed and the Chinese emperor abdicated. And a new government was proclaimed. China from here becomes a republic. When you look at this, it's actually, I think the closest resemblance you can get to it is if the Roman if the Roman Empire had lasted into the 20th century and collapsed in the 20th century. So the Chinese system folded in 1912. The last of the emperors, you might remember seeing the film The Last Emperor. The last of the emperors was a child, and Sun Yat-sen's Kuomintang took power. When World War I broke out, Japan, seeing the Western powers occupied, declared itself to be on the side of the Western powers, but didn't actually take part in the fighting. It celebrated by making 21 demands on China, which would have meant that China pretty much became a Japanese protectorate. That was resisted, and not all of the 21 demands were passed. The worst provisions, the 5 worst provisions of it, were actually rejected, held in abeyance. The 1919 peace settlements, and you will be familiar with those. I would have thought that those peace settlements should have taught us all that finding who to blame for something and saddling them with the blame and the consequences is never going to work, because we know very well that those peace settlements were the preliminary to World War II. The Chinese had contributed labour to the war. Chinese coolie labourers had gone over, I can't remember the number, it may have been 10,000. China was pretty busy with its own affairs at this time. But Chinese labourers had fought, and the Chinese, like a lot of colonial peoples, went to the peace conference thinking that they might get some justice. The Shandong Peninsula was awarded instead to Japan. China was incensed. And for the first time, we really begin to see modern Chinese nationalism emerge. There were popular protests in the street. China refused to sign the Treaty of Versailles. And this really marks the beginning of a modern Chinese nationalism. We can say that it had begun in the late 18th century, but its real emergence as a force comes here. We're not going into the 20s for the moment, but in 1931, after a concocted incident, Japan took the whole of Manchuria and proclaimed it to be Manchukuo. And if you saw the film The Last Emperor, you will remember that the child, now turned into a young man, the child emperor, agreed to act as the head of state, so he became the Emperor of Manchukuo. The League of Nations condemned Japan's actions, said that's very, very naughty, and Japan said, right, we're out of here, and no action was taken. The Japanese went right on with conquest of Manchuria, bombing Shanghai in the process. And in 1937, another concocted incident, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China. There is, in fact, a very good case for saying World War II did not begin in September of 1939, that it actually began in 1937. China received very limited support from the Western powers until 1941. And you will remember that 1941 was the date on which the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, at which stage the Americans began to take the war in China rather more seriously. And at this stage, they began to offer some fairly serious assistance to China. What we very often don't realise in the West was that Japan was fighting a full-scale war in China at the same time as it was facing the Western alliance in the Pacific. So there was a full-scale war raging in China. And as late as 1944, the Japanese launched a major offensive in China against the Chinese forces. The final, I suppose, the most, probably one of the most appalling episodes, and this is bitterly remembered in China. You will notice if you see this reported, and it mostly is once a year, when the Emperor of Japan goes to a place of war martyrs and offers his obeisance to those who died in World War II. He's remembering these soldiers. The rape of Nanjing took place over 6 weeks, beginning in December 1938. It was one of the most horrifying atrocities of the 20th century. The figure that used to be given was 300,000 Chinese dead in Nanjing. That figure has now come down as low as 90,000. But one of the less erudite commentators on it says when you're rounding off murders to the nearest 10,000, it is always, and I won't use his expression, but it is always horrible. And that there are, if you want to look them up, there are 1 million pictures on YouTube of what happened in Nanjing in December, January 1938. They are not pictures I'm willing to put up on my screen. So again, we'll stop sharing and see whether that we've got that lot clear.
Did you see there's a question there from Fern?
Right.
So
who was it who had the question?
Fern has a question. Is it true that Japan had 600,000 troops in China in 1942 as Japan attempted to invade Australia?
Yes. Yes. In fact, I would be surprised if the figure were that low.
Fair enough.
Yes, yes, as I said, Japan was fighting right through World War II. In fact, it is arguable, it is arguable that Japan went into that war. Certainly some Japanese who were responsible for that war, there were Japanese who knew that Japan's chances of winning that war were remote. They knew essentially that it depended on Pearl Harbor, and if the United States was not crushed by Pearl Harbor, their chances of being able to conduct that war were pretty much impossible. They had to make it to get resources, to get fuel supplies. Why did they need the fuel supplies? They needed the fuel supplies to conduct their war in China. One of the precipitating factors for Pearl Harbor was the fact that America had said that Japan had given Japan an ultimatum on the war in China. Japan was not prepared to stop that war and chose instead to attack Pearl Harbor. So China's role, the role of the Chinese war in bringing about the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor is quite large.
Okay, and
Fern, you yes, you're saying something?
so further to that comment. So if China had not offered strong resistance to Japan, Australia may well have been invaded.
Well, so Japan did not have its full resources to be able to direct those against Australia, or for that matter, against the United States.
Okay, Rob? Cool.
Yes.
Thank you.
Did someone else have something to add to that? Right, well, let's go back to sharing. Now, we are now going to take a quick gallop through the Chinese Revolution. Now, as I said, we are going to be very short on detail here. Now, I think I'm where I need to be. Right. So we're coming back now to the end of the Qing dynasty. If you did this at all at school, and our schools did not give a lot of instruction in Chinese history, the figure that you probably would know about is Sun Yat-sen as the leader of the Chinese Revolution. Sun had begun with a party called the Dongminghui in the 1890s. He had a program to offer China. It was fairly vague. Sun was not particularly specific about what he was offering, but it was going to be modern. It was going to be democratic. China was pretty chaotic by 1912. You remember that earlier I had said that the provinces tended to form centres of power themselves, and that process was very much happening by the 19th century. It had happened especially, that this is one of the things one loves about Chinese history. In the mid-century, there had occurred a rebellion called the Taiping Rebellion. Now, when we go look at the costs of the Taiping Rebellion, that is thought to be somewhere between 20 million and 30 million lives lost for this rebellion that occurred. That had been settled by strengthening, by armies developing in the provinces, and that was a very nasty sign. Sun was declared president on the 1st of January 1912, but his presidency was very brief. It lasted only until April, when he yielded the job to Yuan Shikai. He was an individual of very shaky loyalties, but he controlled the most modern of the Qing military forces. He was a man that you needed on side. So China was now disintegrating into regions that were controlled by a diversity of warlords. The period 1915 to 1928 is known as the warlord era. But in fact, this period, we could well argue, goes right through to 1949. The warlord mentality was really one of looking after one's own interests. The government from now on is really a matter of being able to get enough warlords together to hold your faction and to hold control of the capital. So you need to see what happens from here in the context of a nation partly disintegrated. The warlords might or might not continue their support. The most characteristic element of warlord thinking was, how many people am I likely to lose if I stick with this particular alliance? Too many, not going to go there. yes, I know I said last week that I would support this, but no, not going to do it. So when they have the battle, my army won't be there because I'm not going to tell them to do it. Mao Zedong in 1938 said political power grows out of the barrel of a gun, and this is what ruled China right through to 1949 and arguably afterwards. We saw that modern nationalism comes to prominence in China with popular protests against the Treaty of Versailles.
Oh.
It's called the May the 4th movement. And out of that movement, there comes a new energy to Sun's party. And again, you run into the Romanization issue. We always, when we were at school, we were taught it was the Kuomintang. It's more correctly the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party. And the Nationalist Party in the 20s began to create for itself a modern army. The Western powers were not particularly interested in helping the Kuomintang. They were not particularly interested in the new China. But Russia, you remember now, newly a communist state, Russia was very willing to help. So Russia was giving assistance. And in 1921, the Chinese Communist Party was founded in a meeting which almost turned into a fiasco because the police had found out where it was going to be and they all had to move in mid-meeting into the centre of a lake. Mao Zedong was a founding member. Sun died of a cancer in 1925 and he was eventually succeeded by the person we knew as Chiang Kai-shek, but who is now romanized as Jiang Zheshou, which is again closer to the Chinese pronunciation.
Okay, sure.
From 1923 up to 1927, the nationalists and the communists worked together in a fairly uneasy alliance. Mao specialised at this stage in agitating amongst the peasants. He was given charge, I think, of the peasant branch of the Nationalist Party. And so he was working in rural areas. And it is generally said that at this stage, he really began to realise that the peasants had a major role to play in the revolution. Zheng Chang, you may know, wrote a biography of Mao. I forget when that one was released, maybe 3-4 years ago. It could be longer than that. It is totally hostile to Mao and doesn't recognise Mao as ever having any real interest in the parents at all, in the peasants at all. In 1926 to 27, Jiang, with his new Russian-inspired army, launched the Northern Expedition, and this was basically a campaign with some warlords against other warlords, because this was the way politics worked in China at the time. So in 1926 and 27, he launched the Northern Expedition. It was victorious. And at the moment of victory, Jiang turned against his communist allies and he established the nationalist capital in Nanjing. When he turned against his communist allies, this involved massacring everybody who was wearing a red scarf or who seemed to be remotely connected with the communist movement. So we have a pretty characteristic bout of massacres. Here is Sun Yat-sen with his wife, who played a very important role. She was the who was assigned to win over the Americans, which she did with some enthusiasm, perhaps excessive enthusiasm on a couple of occasions. She was one of 3 sisters. The other sister was married, one of her other sisters was married to Sun Yat-sen, and her other sister was married to China's wealthiest man. The marriage of Jiang and Sun Meiling was a political one, but Madame Jiang became a very famous figure in America, and Chiang Kai-shek was, he was very much favoured by the Americans, even as they became increasingly worried by the quality of his regime. And there is Mao Zedong, pretty much as he looked when he was working among the peasants. After the success of the Northern Expedition, that you remember as 1927, Jiang saw himself as facing two threats, the communists and the Japanese. He gave priority to the communist threat. He was later to say that the Japanese were a disease of the skin, the communists were a disease of the heart. And his campaigns in 1934 to destroy the communist base at Jingjiangshan on the Hunan-Jiangxi border had communist forces retreating in what became the famous Long March, which eventually arrived at Yan'an in Shanxi province in the north. This period saw Mao Zedong emerge as leader of the CCP. I would guess that you have all heard of the Long March. It's one of the most famous episodes in the history of the Chinese Communist Party. I remember teaching it to kids, and at that stage, one of my principal references was, of course, Edgar Snow's Red Guard over China. He was an American who seemed at the time to have a fairly objective portrait of Mao. That has been pretty much torn down. The story of the Long March has been very much romanticised. People are still arguing about the route, and I'm not really surprised because the version that you are seeing is in fact a very simplified version. It was not one army that left the Jiangxi Soviet and eventually arrived in Yan'an. There were a number of armies that joined from other regions. So there are a diversity of routes that were taken, but the basic elements of it do still have that heroic quality. And I think I personally find the whole story of the Cultural Revolution, which we will be dealing with in the next session, is fairly sickening when you see the treatment of some of Mao's comrades in arms on the Long March. Jiang continued to focus his efforts on fighting the communists until a bizarre incident in December 1936, when two of his warlord generals cooperated with communists to force him to combine in an alliance against the Japanese. And that was always a very precarious alliance. The principal warlord who kidnapped him for the time was Zhang Zuoliang, had an interesting background. He was out of Manchuria. He did feel rather deeply about the Japanese who had assassinated his father and taken control of his territories. His home base was basically Manchuria, which was about Manchukuo. Both the communists and the nationalists fought against the Japanese. The CCP tending to fight by the strategies that Mao was now associated with, by guerrilla warfare rather than direct confrontation. And there can be no doubting that the nationalists bore the brunt of that fighting. Probably the least desirable job in World War II was as a general liaising with Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist government of China, because they were dealing with corruption on a mighty scale, and a great deal of the aid the Americans sent was disappearing into the pockets of corrupt nationalists. The old warlord mentality continues, so you lined up a nice battle, only to find that one of the warlords had decided that his forces would be better saved for another occasion, so you didn't actually have the troops that you thought you might have. The Japanese, as you know, surrendered after the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the two sides resumed the conflict with each other. The communists were given a good deal of assistance from the Soviet Union, the nationalists from the United States. You will remember that this is the point at which the Cold War was beginning. So it becomes, in a way, one of the first indirect actions of the Cold War. And in October 1949, Mao proclaimed the People's Republic of China in Tiananmen Square. And there he is doing it. Jiang fled to Formosa. No peace settlement has ever been made. Both sides still claim to be the real government of China, and Taiwan remains a hotspot in China's relationships with the world. You will remember that China has insisted that Taiwan not be treated as a separate country by the various airlines of the world. You'll remember that Taiwan is not part of the World Health Organization because China refuses to accept Taiwan as part of the World Health Organization. And so we still have Taiwan as very much a hotspot. And if you really would like to live with a little nightmare, apparently, according to The Economist, the world's most edgy manufacturer of chips, used by both Apple and Huawei, is located in Taiwan, which is an interesting thought to end on. So we can stop sharing, and I've actually managed to cover what I intended to cover. So you are free to comment, and if you have any questions, please ask them. I may or may not be able to answer.
Amazing the knowledge that you have on the subject, Wendy. It's been flabbergasting, to say the least.
It's not really deep knowledge. It's the product of dabbling in China with a lot of matric students.
Wendy, it's Jo here. I just wondered, going on from Reese's comment, what got you interested in China, and what is your background in terms of teaching?
I didn't do China at Melbourne University with my degree, but I did return to the University of Tasmania and had a couple of years dabbling in Chinese history, and I was tutoring in Chinese history for a little while at the University of Tasmania. But it's a country that has fascinated me since I was a little girl.
Right.
I don't know if you can see the chat there, Wendy, but Rob and Fern Messenger said privileged to listen to you. So.
Oh, thank you very much for that. I feel very strongly, as I'm watching what is going on at the moment, I feel very strongly about the lack of respect with which China is treated by the Western press, the antagonistic language I think, does us no favours at all. China has shown itself to be very interested in taking seriously its responsibilities as a global power. Now, I am not for a moment fully in support of all China's policies by any means. I have to say, I'm fairly horrified by the blame game being played over the COVID virus, because I think if we are going to deal with that problem, what we need is not China's opposition, we need China's cooperation.
I'm really busy at the minute. Can you ring back in half an hour? I'm sorry. I'm in a Zoom meeting. I'm sorry. Okay, thank you.
So, yes.
So Zoe, I believe, has a question for you too.
But could Wendy just could you just finish what you were saying? That was really important. Just in the sense that we should be looking at cooperation.
Yeah, and I think seeking cooperation, I think Australia's timing of its announcement that it was going to pursue an independent international inquiry, which you remember came directly after Donald Trump had said that China was going to come clean on the COVID virus or else. And then we chime in and say, well, we're going to seek an independent inquiry. It didn't look like we were seeking an independent inquiry. We looked like the dog yapping at the heels of Donald Trump saying, yeah, us too. And I think that was not for us a good look. I think the idea of an international inquiry has a great deal going for it, but without China's cooperation, we are largely wasting our time. My own sympathies obviously go with those who have said that for China, and you do have to make allowances, China is not and is not going to be in the foreseeable future in any way a transparent government. China begins from the point of view that China's future lies with the Communist Party. The Communist Party is China's salvation, and no way are they going to allow anything that might threaten the Communist Party. That might shake faith in it. Now, I don't know, none of us know the degree of rebellion that exists in China. We don't know how the Chinese feel about their lockdowns. We don't know whether any Chinese thought about going out and protesting in large numbers with guns. I suspect not many of them, because it's not something one does against the Communist Party in China. But we have seen what has happened in the United States, and we need, if we're going, those wet markets are not just in China, they're right through Southeast Asia, but there's no doubt that if we can have China on side in an effort to eliminate those wet markets, we're going to get a whole lot further than we are if China is boycotting the whole process.
Okay.
So,
Thanks. Okay, so Zoe, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Wendy. That most interesting talk, as were the videos that you recommended we watch for further information. And you've shone a light in a very timely way into the darkness in my mind with regards to all things Chinese, except the arts, which I've been a fan of for a long time. And I have I suppose, a theory. Given the Confucian background of the Chinese culture and the 5 characteristics that characterize the Chinese attitude to one another and to the hierarchical structure, it seems to me that all the events that have come to pass to the present time have culminated in the Chinese placing their trust in the Communist Party and in its leader in much the same way as they did during the imperial past. Would you agree that that's why the Communist Party is as successful in governing China as it is, and why President Xi is as revered and trusted as he is by the Chinese people? Would you say that it's basically a morphing from the Confucian imperial background into the present communist People's Republic we have today?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Zoe, because given that collectivist approach, the collectivism underlying the Chinese philosophy of government, it is congenial to something like a dictatorship. That sense of authority and respect for authority is, I think, very much a part of that. Historians have forever compared Mao to another emperor. They are seeing, and people are seeing Xi Jinping in something of the same light. Let's face it, I have to confess, I'm a bit of a romantic in history, and I'm still looking for a hero. All the ones I have developed up to date have developed feet of clay, like many people who's somewhat on the left. Mao was a hero, and I've just had to abandon that. He certainly didn't fit the vision. I'm having hopes for Xi. I'm hoping that he is not another Mao in the making, but we have a saying in the West that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that very much remains to be seen. What I can tell you is that Xi Jinping has brought Confucianism. Confucianism goes in and out of favour in Chinese communism. So at times you dare not mention, I mean, there was a period of knocking the heads off statues of Confucius and rejecting everything old. Xi Jinping is right back there with Confucianism, telling the stories of Confucius. There's even a little program on YouTube that he introduces with Confucianism. So he is well grounded in it. And if you listen to his speeches, you will find him talking in Confucian terms. He will talk about harmony. You will hear him mention that word. It will come up, and you'll be very aware, I think, that she operates from a Confucian background of Confucian framework.
Thanks to your talk, I can fully appreciate that now, which I certainly couldn't before this week. And it's just thrown such a hugely informative, I just feel I understand China and their actions and our reaction to them a great deal more with thanks to this course.
Right, well, next week I'm hoping to move on to look at the events of the second half of the 20th century. I mean, this is one of the most dramatic histories in the world.
There's still a couple more questions if you've got time.
Oh, right, yes. Sorry, I can't see them.
So the messengers have said, can you make comment on Xi's proclamation of dictator for life? And is China comparatively a stable country today under communist rule?
I will put up a YouTube talk that I think will give you food for thought with references for next week. Xi's declaration, it was Deng Xiaoping who introduced a limit to the terms, and Deng would not have expected that would be reversed so soon, that we would see an end to that. There are two schools of thought. The obvious one, espoused by The Economist and generally by the Western press, is he's on the way to becoming a Mao. And it certainly does look like that on the face of it. But
Okay.
and I would hope to open this up next week. Xi Jinping is a very interesting character. I can't empathize with Chinese leaders to the degree that I can with Western leaders, because it seems to me extraordinary that they apparently take in their stride some fairly horrible events. I don't know quite where Xi Jinping comes from, but I think the other version, that we have a new Mao on our hands, there is a view that Xi Jinping is dreaming, as you know, of restoring the Middle Kingdom. When you look at the Belts and Roads Initiative, you are looking at the Middle Kingdom coming back. And that is not a program you are going to achieve in 10 years.
Okay, and I think we'll make this our last. It's a question and a comment together from Sue. Is the CPA synonymous with the princes and princesses, descendants of the revolutionaries? And she's also said, how does the cult of personality fit with the present leader? Do the CPC follow this form of political representation?
Well, China's politics, in the sense of a struggle over power, China's politics happens within the CCP, and it is one of the most opaque processes in the world. And Xi Jinping did catch the China watchers a bit by surprise, because he was not expected to, he wasn't one of the leaders who was recognised as being part of the Chinese succession. But by virtue of his anti-corruption campaign, he comes to the fore very rapidly, and all of a sudden, he is leader of China. We don't know. We really, there you will find on again on YouTube, from where I get much of my current information, you will find that there are experts on the Chinese Communist Party, but there is one of the toughest areas in the world to know about, because nobody seems to write the confessions as to what is going on. The party is very tight. And ultimately, you come down to those 25 men in Politburo, and you come down eventually to the top 5. And you don't know really how much rebellion is simmering in there. You only start to hear about it as it gets really serious. But the party stands as a kind of, is pretty monolithic in its presentation from the top. And we really know who the enemies are, who the rivals are. But Xi Jinping could not afford to nominate a successor, because in China it has been traditional that you accept, well, it's been traditional since Deng Xiaoping. You name your successor at the beginning of your second term. So he's the vice president and everybody knows he's going to be the successor. To name a successor is to name a rival. And that, I think, may be the key to why Xi Jinping overrode that. He obviously has sufficient power to do it at the moment. He has done it. Whether we are heading for a new cult of personality, I don't know. It will be very handy. And the one thing I do think I know about Xi Jinping is he is very, very clever.
Okay, well, Wendy, that's lots of questions there. Would you accept some questions by email, perhaps, from people if they want to continue that conversation further?
Yes, I'd be very happy to accept questions by email.
Okay, so if anybody, if you don't have Wendy's email, then send them to U3A and I'll forward them through to Wendy. And several people have left Wendy, but they've said how much they've learnt and how appreciative they are of the session today. So it's gone really, really well.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you people for listening so patiently.
Marvellous.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Okay. All right, I'll end the meeting now, people. See ya.
Yeah,
Bye.
bye everyone.
Bye.
Good.
Bye.
Bye.